You might often hear people say, I think this is a dumb question, but let me ask. When people are willing to say that, you know that there's some level of psychological safety.
Welcome to the Field Leaders Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Bob McNabb, and with me today are Dr. Richard Trca and Jay Eastman. I appreciate these leaders joining us. We're going to take today a deep dive into psychological safety. This is kind of a specialty for these gentlemen. And on the heels of our series on gospel community, we've talked about safety and the importance of that. And I thought this would be a great bonus episode to dive a little bit deeper into that subject. And so first, I'd love just for our listeners to get to know you gentlemen briefly. And so if you could each give just a brief thumbnail of your history in working on the field and a little bit about yourself. Yeah. Richard, why don't you go first?
Okay, thanks, Bob. And it is, just let me say thank you. It is really a pleasure to be with you and to be with our listeners today. Just a short background following church planting, pastoral and church planting ministry with free churches in Iowa. The Lord led us in 1994 to move to Czech Republic, where we began ministering, training church planters, as well as doing theological education. And then that ministry expanded to further places in Europe where we were working with teams of church planters and church planting networks. 2018, the Lord led me to start thinking about some other growth areas, and particularly within developing communities. And that's when I started my PhD studies at Trinity Divinity School. We have 5 adult children. In our spare time, we enjoy connecting with them as well as with our growing number of grandchildren. So that's a little bit about myself.
Yeah, let me ask a quick follow-up. You mentioned your PhD studies. Can you just tell us what was that? What was the subject?
Yeah, my PhD studies, Bob, focused upon cultivating psychological safety within global Christian organizations.
Okay, I just wanted our listeners to see why I invited you guys onto this. And then Jay has been a practitioner and operated a lot in this space. And so I wanted to ask Jay, would you introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. I was born in the United States and came to faith in graduate school in the Midwest, and was immediately involved in evangelism and really focused on disciple making and church planting. And then right after school was involved in community development and education in El Salvador. And then after El Salvador, went to Berlin, Germany, which is where we live now, where we've been living for about 25 years, in community development, evangelism, disciple making, church planting. And a few years ago, the E-Free Church, the missions arm of that, Reach Global, asked me to be their director of church planting training. And so I've been doing that part-time for the last couple of years and get to develop and practice learning communities for church multiplication in every continent except Antarctica.
I love that. And when I was talking with Richard a couple weeks ago, I said, who else is really attuned to some of these important aspects of developing psychological safety? And he brought your name up. So I'm really excited that you're able to be here with us today as well. But let's just stop at the beginning and ask the question, what is psychological safety?
Let me just jump in. And again, Bob, my research among those 6 global organizations, Christian organizations, and interviewing 26 different leaders within those organizations, they all intuitively sensed what I was talking about when I was asking them questions about psychological safety. They described it as kind of like there was a hope and a sense of a safe learning environment, but they weren't able to put their words on it. And so some short descriptions that I get from the literature, Bob, would be psychological safety is a culture of rewarded vulnerability, or another author has said that it's a felt permission for candor. It's a place where you can be yourself, where you can grow. Some of those people that I interviewed said it is the best place to be, and it's the hardest place to be, because I'm forced to grow and to be stretched into areas that are uncomfortable.
That's good. Jay, to the average leader out there, and you're trying to describe to that leader about what psychological safety looks like on their team, how would you describe it?
We always, from my background as a teacher and as a project developer, we always come at this topic from a learning perspective. What does it look like for a group of people who are different to work together to do more than to accomplish more than they could by themselves? So that whole idea of team, that we accomplish more together, and that requires unity. It requires transparency. It requires humility, and it also requires, as Rich was saying, learning, which to learn is quite difficult. It takes a lot of energy for the human brain to learn. And so psychological safety addresses some really key issues of unity, of really being one together and learning what it means to be unified despite our differences, as well as what does it look like for us to innovate and accomplish more and do something new. And that, I believe, is one of our strongest gifts to the world as believers, is that we have the spirit of creation given to us, that is Jesus himself, that is the Holy Spirit. And he speaks to us, guides us, and we then, through his Spirit, can have these new ideas that the world, I think, really benefits from. And that's a way we can really serve our brothers and sisters around the globe, is with this innovative spirit that comes from God, and that we then hear and learn from one another as we work together in a group.
That's good. I think I first started tuning into the importance of this when I read some research on high-performing teams. And what I was picking up in the research was that when you create such a level of safety within inside of a team where people feel like it's okay to say, I don't feel like I'm good at that. I don't know about that. I need help with that. When they feel like they can admit that, then the amount of synergy and teamwork goes up, and the effectiveness of the team goes up. So really kind of counterintuitive at times to think about a team of people who maybe aren't all sitting around with this high level of confidence and we're going to go get it, but actually a team of people willing to admit their areas where they're not competent, and just to see it happen together to gel and reach that synergy. So great stuff. Well, I'm wondering, as people think about this, if there are some common misconceptions that you discover as you're talking with people. What psychological safety isn't? Can you kind of unpack that for us?
Yeah. Well, Bob, it's not about being Minnesota nice. And so I come from the Midwest, and there's this cultural element that, if there's a piece of food left over, it's not a good idea for you to take it. It's, you want to have a safe place. You don't want to criticize. And psychological safety is not about being nice. In fact, it's about being vulnerably concise and frank. It's not about lowering performance standards. Psychological safety is not a place where people can say, hey, look, we're trying to be psychologically safe. Don't hold me accountable. That's a misconception of what psychological safety is. And maybe just adding on a little bit that atmosphere is a place where we are encouraged to become the people that God has designed us to be. And through his transformational work of the Holy Spirit and through others, we are growing in becoming those people. And so I'm just writing on what Jay was saying. Learning is difficult. And so those are some of what it's not. Jay, anything that you would add on to that?
Absolutely. I'm just going to add on what I read in your research, and what, as we work on our team together, I hear you over and over again, is that this sounds like a term that you wouldn't find in the Bible. Psychological safety. Where's the verse for that? But you have done an amazing job of finding this topic described in Scripture. And so for those of us who, I imagine many people or everyone listening to this podcast or watching this podcast values the living word and the written word of God. And this is a topic that is close to God's heart and is in Scripture. So maybe, Rich, if you have some verses off the top of your head to give to folks now or maybe further on in the podcast, I think that would be really helpful for people to realize this is a biblical topic.
Yeah. And again, just really short, as I look back at God's creative activity where he created women and men in his image, he implanted within them, he hardwired them to be relational. And so that sense of shalom with their creator, with themselves and with one another, the shalom that's not an end in itself, but that produces healthy relationships, that allows us to be stewards of all that God has created. And so I think that's another misperception, is that psychological safety is an end in itself. And yet, as we look in Scripture, we see that maturing process is so that we can fulfill God's mission of relating to him and helping others to find that relationship to him. And so I think that's a biblical foundation that's so important to keep in mind, of shalom as a place of maturing. Not only a place where there's a lack of war or conflict, but it's a place where people are maturing to become who are they designed to become.
That's good. When Jay brought up the idea of what verses, the one that immediately popped into my head was Psalm 23. You think about David walking through the valley of the shadow of death. Boy, you should feel pretty unsafe right then. He says, but you are with me. And so you get this sense of shalom that he has. He's at peace. Think about being in Jesus' arms. Would you feel psychological safety being in his arms? And yet we are his hands and feet. And so being around the body of Christ, where we're ambassadors for him, we're his representatives, people should feel safe around us. But I love the point that you made, that it doesn't mean we're going to coddle, we're not going to challenge each other, we're not going to just help each other grow in Christ-likeness by calling out things that aren't right. I love the balance there. And so that's good stuff. Well, I'm curious about how you guys started to get into this topic. What was the kind of the genesis of that?
I would say that I got into this topic by making mistakes, which is, in my opinion, a huge part of learning, is trying something new that you've never done before, especially with a group of people, and then making mistakes, learning from those mistakes, and then finding what does work and what's the right direction or what's the right process. And so, especially when it came to coming up with community projects in El Salvador, coming up with evangelism approaches and community development here in Berlin, it doesn't work to come up with a great idea in a vacuum. It needs to be done within the community. And so bringing people together who didn't see eye to eye, but wanted to do something for the community, and finding a process where people could be unified because of the greater vision. Even though they had some personal differences, the greater vision for the community was something they all believed in, and therefore they would work together. And then forming ways that they could learn from one another to figure out what is it that we can do together. And so one quick story is that there was a neighborhood with some really severe poverty issues in a corner of Berlin that we lived in. And there were the right radical group that lived in this neighborhood and the left radical group. And they were physically hurting each other. And it was just a mess. But there were issues that were hurting their children, regardless of which political leanings they had. And so they agreed to work with us as peacemakers to figure out solutions that would keep their children safe. And so it was a beautiful way of becoming transparent and working with one another and creating an environment, a platform for them to see the greater good and putting aside their differences and creating safety for unification, but also for innovation to do some things differently. And so I didn't know it was called. I came at it as a learning community approach. And then I have the privilege of starting to work with Rich about a year ago. And as he was talking about his research, it just opened up a new vocabulary and a much more helpful vocabulary than the standard, learning vocabulary that I had before. So have been practicing it under a different name, and now am delving into the details with Rich and really being able to, it's enabling us as a team and as a ministry here. So as a global team with Rich, but also as a local ministry here in Berlin to take new steps with this practice.
That's good. What about you, Rich?
Yeah, I think very similar, Jay. These concepts are intuitive in the sense of people, of me, wanting to be in a place where there is safety to ask questions, where you don't feel dumb, where you can try things. And so in my context of working with church planners and church planning teams, and even in the theological training context, I would see some groups that would embrace those concepts, would talk about them, would even have some little squabbles as they were trying to figure things out, and there was disagreements, but they were disagreements about the topic at hand and not about the person. And those were the groups that would embrace those new concepts, think about them, put them into practice. And then I noticed that there were some groups where the learning stayed just kind of cognitive. And we would talk about theological concepts, and they would kind of keep them away from themselves. And just not a lot of application then that would come out of those group of students or even those church planning teams. And I asked myself, there's a difference. Is there any way of being able to study that difference between the groups that cause people to grow or invite them to grow? And in my PhD studies at Trinity, I began looking at different learning formats and how people learn. And I stumbled across this concept called psychological safety. Never heard it before. But most of the research had been done in healthcare professions as well as financial planning, where in a healthcare profession, for example, you're needing doctors and nurses that are at different educational levels and even different positional levels to be able to work together for the sake of the patients. And so lots of research has been done in for-profit organizations, but not so much in nonprofits. And so that started me down the path even of just wanting to talk with leaders in different global situations. Tell me about how, and I didn't use the word psychological safety because I was afraid that would almost cause them to kind of shy away from that topic. But each of them intuitively said, we've been doing that. We're trying to do that. But Richard, you're putting a name on it and you're helping us to understand and use a vocabulary so it just doesn't remain with a person and it comes out of his personality, but our whole teams can now start applying those developmental steps and being able to watch for it and together trying to cultivate that. So that's where I am. And Jay has given me some great practical ideas about how do we implement that within teams, within different cultural contexts. And so still growing and still learning about the application of that.
That's good. As you're talking about this in the kind of the secular world and the importance of it and how it is often needed, I think about a Korean flight crew where the captain was making a series of mistakes and the first officer was afraid because of a lot of cultural influences to speak up. And they ended up crashing. They figured this out from listening to the cockpit recorder. And so after that, they began realizing the importance of what they call crew resource management, CRM. And it's this idea of creating a safety in the cockpit where they can really work as a team. And so for me personally, I've tried to apply that in when I'm driving in the car with my wife. And when she says, watch out for that, instead of taking it as an offense and saying, I know how to drive, I've been driving for 50 years, I try to say, okay, yeah, good, thanks. And realize, hey, don't just squash somebody when they're trying to step in and help, but let it be a safe place where we can really work as a team. So I related, as you're talking about some of these other professions, how important it is. Now, I don't know if they always use that term, and I don't know if this term has been used by church planters. But as I think about the young, aspiring team leaders that we may have listening, or those who are currently leading, and they're saying, okay, I was gung-ho to go and lead my team in this direction, to go reach the world, and now I'm listening to this episode and I realize, oh, this really is important. How can they kind of evaluate, how can they know, like, what do we have psychological safety on our team right now? How can they kind of gauge where they are with this?
Yeah. And your story, Bob, just reminds me early in my career of wanting to be very focused and missional. I look back on that and I see that I think the Lord, by His grace, blessed my efforts of bringing together teams and helping us to stay on track and focused. And yet, as I look back, and even in those times, I got glimpses of people saying, wow, Rich, you are really intently focused and intense on this, aren't you? And I counted that as almost like, well, thank you. Yes, I am very much, following the way of Christ and listening to Him. And not realizing that in my intensity was bringing almost an anxious culture, or I was bringing about almost like a comparison among my team members, or even a fear of saying, look, I'm not doing so well as what you would hope, Richard. And so I realized that people intuitively desire to know that they belong, that they can learn, they can make mistakes. How do we know that we even have that psychological safety when we don't? There's activities, there's actions that we are doing, and so a team that is high on the scale of psychological safety is practicing collaboration. They're talking about issues. They're not talking about the people who may be forming those issues. They're engaging together to explain what is our mission and how are the ways that we're trying to accomplish that. You might often hear people say, I think this is a dumb question, but let me ask. When people are willing to say that, you know that there's some level of psychological safety. And I think that's important too, to say that every group, every team has psychological safety. It's just that sometimes it's on the low side, sometimes it's at the higher side. It's a fluid continuum of where we are. And you may know some of those teams that have been a little bit more on the low side, in which, people are like, wow, I don't want to enter into that conversation. Or I think this isn't going well, but I'm not going to say anything. So, yeah, those are kind of how to judge and how do we measure. I think there's some good assessments that I'm familiar with that I've kind of worked out as well to help teams to just start a discussion about where we are and where we want to move to as well.
That's good. Jay?
Yeah, I'll follow up. The first idea that came to mind when you were talking, Bob, were feedback loops, which are really important in iterative development, where you try something and then you get a feedback loop, and then you keep trying as the feedback comes in, if you're going on the right direction or if something's fruitful. And so the most important thing for us as leaders is our feedback loops. And there is a model of leadership where the leader is expected to know everything and therefore is closed off to feedback loops, because if they know everything, they don't need feedback. And I believe this to be a severely dysfunctional model. It puts too much pressure on one person. You may have an incredibly gifted leader. That leader still is not God. I mean, if it's a person, if it's a human living today, it's not God and that person. So we really do need those who have different perspectives, those who see and think differently, to give us as leaders really good and clear feedback and to be encouraged. And some relationships, more encouragement is necessary. And so it's really important as a leader to approach the team, to approach your working relationships, and to say, please give me feedback. Please help me understand how you see things, what you understand. And one great question is, what do you think I'm missing? Or where do you think we're off? What needs to change? And you may need to repeat that so that they really know that you mean it. So
That's good.
That's a huge one. Leaders have blind spots. I mean, all people have blind spots. The thing with leaders' blind spots is that it impacts other people as a team. And so it's important to get as much information and perspective as possible where others have information and perspective that you don't.
That's good. I think about Patrick Lencioni and when he talks about dysfunctions of a team. And I think about, he says one of the ways you know you've got a healthy team is when there's vigorous debate. You know, if you don't have a lot of debate, then I would guess you don't have a lot of safety because people are afraid to put it out there. And I think that might be a sign that we could look at as well. And I'm thinking about the two-way street that there is there, that it's not just the leader who needs to be a safe person, that the followers can think, okay, it's okay for me to share my opinions. There won't be repercussions. That's important. But I'm also thinking about followers who need to create psychological safety for their leader. You know, if he or she opens up for us to vigorously debate this, it would probably be even more welcomed if that leader knew that you were really behind them, that you're really on their team. You're not going to kick and scream if the leader doesn't decide to do it the way that the vigorous debate, that you debated, but that, you're behind them, you're with them, and you recognize the role that God's put them in. And so I think it's a two-way street there in creating the psychological safety. Well, how do we cultivate this? How do we, if we see the need for it and we go, okay, I think if you're like me, you probably realize, I don't know if I've created that as much as I should have. And so if there's a leader thinking, okay, what steps can I take to cultivate this on my team? What would you guys suggest?
Rich, how about I start on this one?
Please.
Great. I think just two words come to mind, and one is fit and the other is function. And so it really is important that as we work on a team that we are constantly saying, hey, you being this way, your personality, your thoughts and actions, your love, your grace, your truth-telling, this is how that really that helps our team fit together. Not just you fitting on the team, but everyone fitting together. And so fit, I think, is an important aspect of practicing this well. And then function means us thinking of new ways, more effective ways, more fruitful ways to approach advancing the kingdom. That could be outreach, evangelism, disciple making, church planting, church sustaining. And because the word of the Lord never changes. God is faithful and he does not waver or change. The world and culture, however, shift constantly. And so our task is taking this immutable truth and finding ways to express it in language and action to people who haven't experienced it for themselves. And we need to be innovative in doing that. So D.A. Carson's Christ and Culture, for example, is a really good book on that. But I believe that's our job as leaders and as practitioners, to be a living translation of God's truth and God's love. And that takes innovation. And so that's the function part of psychological safety, is figuring out how to do just that.
Good. What about you, Richard?
Yeah. I'll take kind of a foundational view. What are some foundations? And then almost like a process. And I think foundationally, it's trusting and believing that God desires for our communities to be places where we can experience his transformation. And because the body of Christ is the place where his Holy Spirit resides, we can count on God wanting to transform us more and more into his image of his Son. And I think psychological safety is a social science term that just unpacks the beauty of what God has already made true in our world, and that he desires people to grow, to become more servant-minded, to be more reflecting his qualities within this world. And so you use that term, Bob, too, of cultivating. And I think another foundation is that it's a developmental process. It's not, do we have it, do we not? It's a gradual progression of developmental steps, I would say. Here's a misnomer that as I've done some seminars or workshops with some people, that there's often the desire for when you're forming a new team or when you are as a new leader coming in and you're saying, look, I want our group to be a place where we can have robust dialogue, where we can really get at issues and talk about them and struggle and critique, and iron sharpens iron. And I say, that's not a way to develop it, because it just is not understanding the developmental process that people need to go through. Can I risk just learning? Can I risk just raising my hand and saying, I don't understand this. Can we go backwards a little bit? And would you be willing to just kind of back up, because I'm just not with you guys? I think that's a place that developmentally is developing psychological safety. Tim Clark, and I rely upon a lot of authors. Timothy Clark would be a person that I think uses a model that's very helpful, in that he talks about that first stage of psychological safety being just answering basic questions. That first one is, do I belong? And so being able to just have a place where people can say, yes, you belong, you're a part, there's fit. Jay, as you were saying, here are your gifts. Here are the areas of weaknesses that you can collaborate with others on. So that first developmental step is a place of belonging safety. That second level, Clark calls learning safety. And that just answers the basic question of, can I learn here? Can I make mistakes in learning new things? And that third developmental step is contributor. Can I add value to my team? Again, a question that is so basic to every human is not only do they want to belong, but they want to offer and contribute something to the people around them, to know that their lives and their efforts are making a difference. And then that fourth level of psychological safety, Clark calls challenger safety. And that is answering the question, can I ask questions about the status quo? Can I challenge the way things are happening? And Clark talks about that as being a place where many teams never reach, because they're pretty satisfied with the status quo and not tipping over the apple cart, not rocking the boat. But he says it's only those teams that move into challenger safety when they become innovative, when they become able to do some things and go some directions that maybe they haven't before. And so that I think, Bob, it's helping people to think developmentally and helping people then to walk through those developmental steps, just as humans grow from children to teenagers to adults of maturity.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful for leaders to understand that challenging one another, having the vigorous debate is a fruit of safety. It's not the way you get there. That's the fourth step,
good.
Not the first, right?
That's good.
It's a sign that you have it, but you really have to kind of walk through these. And we'll put up on the screen here for our YouTube watchers this diagram, and we'll try to put some in the links for those who are just listening of the diagrams that you have and some of these that you're talking about. But I guess the next question I have is, all right, so let's say a team leader and is working to cultivate this psychological safety on their team. How long should it take? Is this something that you can do in a weekend? Is this something that'll take years? How long before people really start to feel like, okay, this is safe. I'm really enjoying working on this team. And how long does it take until you start seeing increased levels of effectiveness as a team?
Kind of discouragingly, there's a Forbes article that says that psychological safety takes years to develop and seconds to shatter.
Yeah.
Okay. And so I wouldn't fully agree with that, because I think even as I just kind of shared about those developmental steps, I think from the very beginning of just me in my ability to choose and to try to cultivate psychological safety, whether I'm a leader, whether I'm a member of the team, just by practicing curiosity, asking questions, demonstrating I don't know everything and I need some help, or practicing empathy, trying to see things from the other person's perspective, or even just practicing humility. I need you guys. I know I come to the team with some strengths, but these are my weaknesses, and Bob and Jay, I see that you have these strengths. I want to learn to depend upon you. So I think that those sort of qualities can start showing up very early in a leader's attempt to try to cultivate that psychological safety. So I don't know about instantaneous, but I would say in those first few months of meeting, people are going to get a vibe. Can I belong? Can I learn? Can I contribute? And if there are positive answers to those, it's going to keep growing.
That's helpful.
Thanks, Rich. I have two thoughts on your question, Bob. And the first one is, how long does it take to learn a language and to learn a culture? Because psychological safety is part language and definitely a lot of culture. And the answer is a fair amount of time. It's not a simple mental exercise. It's a changing of perspective, of attitudes, of behaviors. So it does take, as far as especially adult learning, you really have to work at it and practice it over and over again for it to be what you might want to see more quickly. So it will take time. Here's the good news. Think about taking a trip. When I was at university, the closest relatives I had were 11 hours away. So it was a long ways in a car. But as soon as I got in the car, I knew I was heading to people who loved me. I knew I was heading to, some of the best food I could remember. And I was heading to a home. And so I was happy during that first minute of the drive, even though I knew it was a long drive. I was happy. I knew that we were going in the right direction. So I think that's important also to talk about in this case is if you are in a situation that's not great, you take a point and say, okay, we're not in a good place, but is the trajectory up or is it down? And if you're talking about psychological safety, if you're making steps in psychological safety, the trajectory will be up. And so people will say, okay, we're going in the right direction. We may not be where we want to be, but we're going in the right direction. And especially if you were going down before and you've transitioned now to up, that's going to give people a lot of hope and trust. Yeah. And so even though it might take a little while, the direction is critical.
Yeah, that's great.
That's good.
I've seen from my own experience that you can't microwave it, but you can kind of create an incubator for it. You can help get the right context set so that it can grow more rapidly than it would otherwise. And that's what one of the things we looked into when we started looking at our Missio Nexus Field Leaders Network, and we started talking about having these learning communities and peer coaching groups. Nice. We started talking about, well, where do we begin with this? And so we started surveying leaders and said, hey, the learning communities you've been in the past, the peer groups you've been in the past, what made those really good, and why aren't you in those anymore? Some of them. Why did the ones just fade away? And we heard from our leaders two things that were really important. One was a good facilitator who just kept herding the cats, but the other one was trust. They said, you know what? The really good groups we've been in, there was a high level of trust. And I think trust and psychological safety are just right there together. And so that's why we've decided to have our first season of the podcast be about entering into gospel community in real, authentic, kind of safe ways with one another, because we believe as leaders and team members do that, it'll create an incubator that will help teams get to that place of safety and trust so that they can jump into the ministry discussions in the right kind of context and environment and really experience that synergy. And so I hear you guys, it does take a while, doesn't it? But I do want to encourage leaders that even though it takes a while, there are things you can do to nurture it and cultivate it as we go. But there are also things we can do that destroy it in a hurry, like you guys just mentioned, some barriers that we can put up. And so I'd love for you guys to, from your experience, what are some of the barriers and some of the big mistakes that we need to avoid?
Yeah. Jay, tell all your mistakes, man.
we don't have enough time.
I'll follow up, yeah.
I will limit it to a couple select samples. How's that? Coming from a very works-oriented background and then coming to faith, as a young adult in my 20s, thinking that I had to do it and I had to do it by myself. The Lone Ranger type of mentality is a huge barrier, because you're shutting yourself off from making mistakes, you're shutting yourself off from feedback loops, you're shutting yourself off from really the biblical image of the body working together, and that we really do, as Rich said, we need each other. And also, I believe that the sanctification process is a process, and we grow, we take steps of faith, we stumble, we are strengthened and get back up again, take new steps. So I think that's also a really important piece, is that we are not perfect. And thank you, Bob, for at the very beginning, before we turned on the recording, saying, hey, we may make mistakes in the recording, we'll fix it. That was a huge blessing to me. And then, I think within different cultures, we have ways of selecting whom we listen to and selecting from whom we learn. And so Richard and I are on a team together, and we have a couple key values, and one of them is pursuing the heart of the Father. That before we do any thinking, speaking, action, we pursue the heart of the Father. And the next one is radical learning, that we wish to learn from anyone and everyone, and believe that we have something to learn from anyone and everyone. And that takes humility, but also curiosity. And so I would say those are areas that I have failed monumentally in each and every one. I struggle with pride every day, and sometimes I think I've learned it, and I'm not remaining curious, but I start to get judgmental. And so if you notice yourself becoming judgmental or judging someone, a brother, sister, or a situation, then I would say that's a warning sign that you're not staying curious and really looking to create psychological safety, to learn in trust and transparency. That's another word that we haven't used yet. I think trust we've used before, but transparency is a cousin of trust. And that's one of the qualities that we're going for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just some of the barriers to cultivating psychological safety, Bob, that I've noticed are there's internal and external, and I'm just reiterating what Jay has said is that I as a leader know that I can be the greatest cultivator as well as the greatest inhibitor, and a lot of that has come, I think, in my life of reflecting upon my growth, the things that I have just taken on as leadership concepts. Like, I've got to have all the right answers. I got to get this right. Nobody cares about this job as much as I do. And what that does, that isolates me into thinking, boy, I can't show that I am not doing this well, or that I'm drowning in all of this work. And so I think there's some of those internal aspects. I know too, as I look at my team members, I know that each of them has come from probably some really hard learning cultures. I think of working so long in Eastern Europe, and shame culture is very powerful there. Children, as they grow up, even adults, there's a high influence of being in the collective, and shame is a very powerful instrument of learning. And so I know that the people that I work with, and I know shame culture well is well in Indian or African cultures of people wanting to meet the standard of the collective and not being willing to admit that, hey, there's some areas that I need to grow in. There's some external ones too. I know even organizationally, our team members may get pushback, and I heard this from several of the people that I interviewed, of getting pushback from their upper management or upper leadership, and asking you, why are you spending so much budget time on team building? Why are you spending time, as you described to me, your meetings, your 90-minute meeting, and you spend a half hour doing updates with people? What did you really accomplish in that meeting? And so I think there's some external inhibitors or barriers that maybe even our leaders in our organizations aren't seeing the importance of cultivating those relationships, which is really the root of being able to work well together, so that the fruit is the ministry that comes out of that. Yeah.
Yeah. And nobody's saying that that psychological safety is the end goal. No, it's the foundation that we can build a building upon.
Yes.
And so absolutely.
Yeah. And let me just add there, that is so important. And that comes out in practice in the literature, Bob, that psychological safety is not the end goal. It's not the tail that wags the dog, but rather it's the catalyst that opens up the opportunity for people to talk, to voice, to give feedback, to evaluate. And yet it needs to be intentionally cultivated so that we can be accomplishing those team goals.
Yeah, I love that. And I love what you said earlier on about, it doesn't mean we're not practicing radical candor. I think about the book and the teaching about that. And, you can't do the radical candor without the safety there, though. And so what a great thing. Now, I'm thinking about our listeners who have heard us talk about the importance of it and some of the barriers and how it really kind of unfolds in stages. But let's make it really practical if we could. Like, if I'm a little overwhelmed right now, like, I see it, but what do I do? So can you help nail down, like, what would be some first steps? What were some baby steps in the right direction if I'm a leader and I want to increase the psychological safety on my team?
Okay. Let me start, and then Jay, you can really clean up and make this even more practical. Okay. A thought comes to mind, Bob, is that I would just encourage people, work to become consciously competent of values and practices of psychological safety. Okay. And that's a term, that all people go through a learning process, and we start something brand new. We're just unconsciously incompetent. Okay, I don't even know about this. And then I realize, that's important. And so now I become consciously, but I'm still incompetent. Okay. And so I'm reading, I'm studying, I'm learning, I'm hearing, I'm listening to podcasts so that I'm becoming consciously competent. I'm knowing a few of the things that I want to be looking for. I'm aware of the terms. I'm sharing my learning with others. And then that fourth, I think, most mature step, I'm becoming unconsciously competent. It's flowing out of me. And so just encourage our listeners, start by just being aware of seeing the value of having that safe learning environment, and then start learning about it. Read from some authors like Timothy Clark, Amy Edmondson, Steve Cuss. I'll share some other resources here, but become consciously incompetent at this point. Choose that. Yeah,
that's great.
Yeah, I think a few questions come to mind. The first is, where are we? A lot of times we'll get asked to come into a situation, give some consulting and some coaching, and one of the best questions we ask is, well, where are you? And a lot of people say, oh, we're here, and they actually, where they say they are is not really where they are. And so a lot of people think they're at a different place than they really are. And so asking that question can help the group identify if they agree or if they disagree. I think another really good question is, where do you want to be? And to see if there, especially if there's a written vision statement, and do they, what they say, where they want to be in the vision statement, if those are the same, to talk about whether they're unified and working in the same direction. And then most directly within this topic would be, how honest are we with one another? When you're dissatisfied, do you express it, on a scale of 1 to 10? And sometimes that can be done in a group, and sometimes it's best everyone write it on a card so it's anonymous, if there's a sense that this might not be a group that is practicing psychological safety. So
that's good.
That's good.
I think my thoughts were initially like, what activities could we do with the team? So I like, Rich, how you put it back on the leader. Like, hey, you want to start seeing this happen on your team? Start with yourself. And I like that emphasis. And then, Jay, really helpful, the idea of, where on the map here, where's our red dot, like in the airport, we are here, getting an idea of, those are two great places. Work on yourself and get a good, honest estimation of where you are. Mm-hmm. Okay, so what if we did want to start working on ourselves? What would be some resources, or if we wanted to do some exercises with our teams? Could you guys recommend some resources? And we'll try to put some links on our show page to these resources that are mentioned, but would love for you guys to highlight some of those for us.
Yeah. Somebody that has been really helpful because she's very fair in her writings is Amy Edmondson. Anything you can find on Amy Edmondson's articles, books, if you Google that, you're going to find lots of hits. Mm-hmm. Timothy Clark is somebody who has been studied in organizational development, and so I think he provides a good model for those developmental stages. He has a website as well, Leader Factor, that I go to often to provide resources for other people. A couple other books that come to mind: Jim Harrington's Leader's Journey, and Steve Cuss's Managing Leadership Anxiety. Talk about helping us to see relationships as a systems. And they talk about systems theory of seeing how we are intricately connected and that we affect one another. And so how do I grow in my understanding, awareness of how I'm affecting my relationships and how they're affecting one another? And then, Bob, not to toot my own horn, but I think my research among global leaders has provided not just the values, but also the practices, the helpful principles of how do we cultivate this all the way from a high power distant society to a collectivistic, to an individualistic, just a wealth. And it was such a gift to be able to interview those people and then to put that into my dissertation. I put that on my LinkedIn just as an executive summary. You may not want to read the whole thing, but here's a short summary for that as well.
No, that would be excellent, and thank you for making that available. Jay, what about you?
I would agree. I think one of the best resources would be Rich's executive summary. It's incredibly accessible, but has a lot of great principles at work in it. And when I first started talking to Rich about joining our team and our global team, And just as he talked more about the topic, it's like, oh, this is going to be good for our team. Like, our team is going to be richer with Rich as a team member because of his research. But also, so I'm also on a leadership team for Reach Global, and our team needs to go through this with you. And so he came to one of our meetings and led us through his research, and it has changed how we talk with one another. He's working with another one of our colleagues and their team. And so I think, Rich's research, his ability to consult and coach is a huge resource. The other one that comes to mind is what generally would be called learning community approach. Mm-hmm. So if leaders here would just Google learning community processes and get some basic understanding of what a learning community is, it's figuring out ways to ask new questions and come up with innovative solutions. The one that I've been trained in is called results-based conversation or conversations from Tom McGehee. And I think he may have sold the rights to that, so someone else may be responsible for that material now, but RBC, or results-based conversations, I find to be a great way to enter into having questions and using models to develop really honest conversations with one another in a safe way.
That's good. That's good. And I have one final question before we wrap it up today. I'm thinking about some of our listeners are coaches of team leaders. They're supervisors of team leaders, and they have conversations with the team leaders that they're supervising. And I'm wondering if you had a coaching question or two that they could maybe ask a team leader that would just help bring up this issue, that would maybe stimulate reflection and thought. If you were coaching a team leader and you met with them maybe once a month and you're kind of talking about different things about how it's going in their ministry and their team, what would be a question or two in this area that you might encourage them to ask?
I would start with asking, who's the member of the team who's not communicating more, at the average of your team? So there's usually one member who's contributing less written or verbal input. And then one of the questions with that is, okay, why might that be? And to investigate if that person has a reticence to contribute based on a psychological safety, issue. And it may be a person, has a high introversion score and just needs more time. Feels very welcome to contribute, just needs more time. Great. It could be, though, that the person needs more encouragement. And there are personalities that really need permission to challenge. It's how they're wired, and we as leaders need to constantly invite and give permission for that person to speak his or her mind. So I think that would be a big one. And then I think it's also really important to say, okay, what's your rhythm for taking the pulse of the team? So, we can get into a pace of team life, and if we don't ever stop to say, okay, how's our pulse doing? Are we working too hard? Are we not challenged enough? We need to constantly, and I would say quarterly, but every leader needs to determine that for his or herself. But when is the schedule for taking the pulse of our team? How are we doing? Are we being honest? Are we speaking truth in love? Do we need to work on something? Is there a topic that people are afraid to speak about? Are we missing the boat in any way? So coming up with a schedule to take the pulse of the team.
Those are some fantastic questions. Thank you for those. Yeah. Those are really helpful. Any thoughts, Rich?
Yeah, Bob would start and just call them inside out questions. So starting from the inside of the leader and then looking outward. And that first question that I think would be helpful is just asking my coachee, how are you becoming more of a safe person yourself? How are you growing? And this is not for the faint of heart, and I say that. But how would your wife, your children, your team members describe the qualities of safety that you are exhibiting? Okay. It's not a yes or no. And it gives you an evaluation of how am I doing with just being the first person to create safety? How am I living out of a joyous overflow of my life in Christ? And then how is that having fruit around me? And then that outside question, that inside out question is, what are you doing with your team to intentionally cultivate a sense of belonging, a sense of learning, a sense of contributing, and then a sense of challenging? And so I'm just going through those kind of developmental stages and asking them to think, what are you doing to intentionally help people to build, yep, I belong, I can learn, here's something that I can offer, contribute, and this is where I'm being challenged and challenging the team.
Yeah, that gives some really practical, handles on it to ask questions in each one of those areas. I like that. Well, thank you guys so much for your time today. And this really works perfectly with our discussion of gospel community. And I think we're talking about this psychological safety, one, for the health of the people involved, but also we see it as a valuable foundation for seeing more high-performing teams. And so it really is valuable in a couple different ways. So thank you guys so much. And for our listeners, we thank you for listening. This has been an episode of the Field Leaders Podcast, a ministry of Missio Nexus and a part of the Missio Nexus Podcast Network.